Greetings from Cambodia. My name is Craig Greenfield. I wish I was there with you for this training. I know that you're going to be learning a lot about the Alongsiders movement, now spread to so many countries around the world, so many vulnerable children and youth being impacted. But where did it all start? That's the story I want to share with you today, the birth of Alongsiders. Well, in the year 2000, my wife Nay and I, Nay was a Cambodian refugee, we moved to Cambodia and we moved into a slum community in a very poor area of Phnom Penh, the capital city of Cambodia. And at that time, a lot of children being impacted by all kinds of things, being orphaned by AIDS, being orphaned by other reasons. Poverty was rampant throughout the whole nation. And of course, we know that poverty affects the most vulnerable amongst us the most. And so as we began to get to know our neighbors and began to come alongside them, we really began to reach out to the most vulnerable children. The words of Jesus ringing in our ears, "Blessed are the poor." Jesus said in his mission statement in Luke 4, "I've come to bring good news to the poor." And we began to ask those questions. How are our lives proclaiming good news to the poor, especially the most vulnerable children? And one of those children that we began to come alongside was a little boy by the name of Tira. And Tira had been orphaned along with his sister and his brother. They were in very, very difficult circumstances, and we began to come alongside them, make sure that they were going to school, make sure that they had enough to eat. And as we began to do that and introduce them to the love of Jesus, the God of the fatherless, the God who welcomes the children into families, we realized that not only was Tira in that kind of situation, but millions more children. Now, each of us can perhaps come alongside 1, 2, maybe if we are super Christians, we could come alongside 10 or 20 children. And we certainly didn't want to take them away from their families and their communities and put them in an orphanage. We wanted to see those children growing up in their own communities, in their own extended families, supported by that, but coming to know the love of Jesus and to have someone who would especially come alongside them and really encourage, coach, mentor, and in the words of Jesus, disciple them. To go into all the world and make disciples is our commandment as Christians. And so how could we disciple these millions of children? It couldn't be something that could be done by one person or 2 or even 10. It will take a movement of young people. And as we looked at the church in Cambodia, we realized the church is very young. As it is in many parts of Asia, India, Nepal, all across Africa, the church, the population is very young. And so there's this untapped resource of young people. And in fact, as we looked at history and we studied the history of social movements, we saw that young people have always been on the forefront of movements for change. We realize that young people are the ones who still hold hope for change. They're not jaded, they're not cynical. They think that they can change the world, and that's a wonderful thing. If you're going to change the world, you've got to start with a sense that it can be changed. Young people with less responsibilities, more connected to their peers, more connected to technology. And we realized that God was giving us the answer of how we could possibly reach all these vulnerable children around the world. And that answer lay in the youth, the young people, the young adults of the world, especially in places where there is so much poverty. These are the people who will bring change. And so we began to pray as I walked alongside Tira and invested in his life one-on-one. I began to pray that God would raise up many more, many hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of young Christians who would do the same. And so I began to cast the vision, share the vision. And the first 10 young people came together and said, "Okay, young Christians, we will walk alongside vulnerable children. Show us where they are." And so we matched them up. They didn't know these vulnerable children. We quickly realized that they had seen themselves as volunteering for us, kind of doing us a favor. And we realized that we were missing a key ingredient, and that was the ingredient of ownership. And so we changed our strategy, and we said, you young people need to go to God. and pray and ask God to show you who is the vulnerable child that God is laying on your heart. So it's a covenant agreement between you and God. You own that relationship, not some NGO, not some organization. You own that relationship. And so they did that. They began to pray and ask God who they should walk alongside. And as Tira grew up, he himself became an alongside. I remember Tira telling me, Craig, I prayed for 2 months for God to show me the young boy that I should walk alongside in the way that you walked alongside me. And Tira chose a little boy who was involved in the streets, involved in gangs, scavenging, and Tira poured his life into that little boy. One generation reaching the next. This idea of a self-sustainable discipleship movement where each generation would impact the next, and so on and so on. Here in Cambodia, we're now on to 4 or 5 generations. One of the other key changes we made in the early days was at first we said, okay, we've got 10 alongsiders. We'll pay $1 for each of you to go and do some kind of activity. Take your little brother to the zoo, take them to have a snack. $1 every month. But I remember a very wise old lady said to me, you have 10 alongsiders. What will happen when you have 10,000? It costs you $10 now. Will you have $10,000 when it grows to 10,000? And we realized that this was going to be an obstacle. And so with fear and trembling, we went to the alongsiders, a small group then, and we said, look, if this is going to grow, it needs to grow in a grassroots way without outside money. It needs to grow in a way where it is totally owned. I'm not the founder of Alongsiders. The founders of Alongsiders are the ones who birth and grow Alongsiders in each place. And so that ownership, that sense of ownership needs to flow through. And so as we told these Alongsiders, look, there's no more money for outings, we thought they'll all quit. And to our amazement, all of them said, no, we want to continue. This is a covenant relationship between us and God and this child, this little brother or sister that God has given us. And we will continue, whether there's money or not. And from that point on, the movement began to grow. One of the other keys, and I'll just share with you one last key that has really made a difference, and that is the principle of proximity. We began to ask the alongsiders, pray and ask God to show you one of your neighbors. Don't travel across town like a NGO volunteer. Choose a neighbor. Choose a child who's vulnerable. Choose a child who's in a tough situation. It will be much easier for you if you live near that child. You can visit them every day. They're right there when you come home. It's much easier. There's no cost to go and travel to disciple them. And so this principle of proximity was another key. And to this day, the Alongsiders movement has continued to grow throughout Asia and Africa, into Europe and Latin America now. God is doing an amazing work. Very little to do with me. I was just the person who first began to disciple that child, like many others have done throughout history. The key is in the calling of God on your heart, on the calling of God in your hearts of your young people. They are the key that God is raising up all around the world like a mighty wave. And the question for the church today is, will we ride that wave that God is raising up? Or will we stand on the beach and watch it go by? Or will we turn our backs and be drowned by the wave that is rising up? All right, bless you guys. Continue to seek after God. Continue to have a heart for the poor and the most vulnerable. And hope to see you right here in Cambodia one day. Blessings.